Welcome to Beyond the Surface. On our podcast, we highlight underrepresented voices in architecture. We'll humanize architects by uncovering who they are beyond the surface. Hi, I'm your host, Alex Sanchez, representing the Illinois Tech student chapter of the National Organization of Minority Architects. Today's episode is called The Power of Design with our guest, Chana Haouzi. Chana Haouzi is an architect, educator, and founder of Architecture for Public Benefit. The firm has award-winning projects featured in the Chicago Architect magazine and recognized for projects from organizations like the Boston Society for Architecture and from AIA Chicago. She is a recipient of the 2022 AIA Young Architects Award. She holds a master's in architecture too from Harvard University and a master's of architecture and bachelor's of science in architecture from McGill University. Chana has been teaching since 2014, leading design studios at the University of Chicago's Art History Department and the University of Illinois Chicago. Prior to these roles, Chana served as an associate teaching professor for design, for environmental justice and public good in the built environment at Northeastern School of Architecture. Thank you for being here with us today. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling good. Thanks, Alex.
I'm excited to have this conversation with you. I know we talked a little bit before, so I'm excited to get to know where your story began and how you got to where you are right now. Let's get started with the first question. Can you tell us about your background and how that influenced your identity?
Yeah, I really love this question. I feel like it's a really important way to start any discussion, and I've appreciated also the responses that other people have answered to this. I think it's important because our identity actually influences how we approach projects and the way that we're going to solve design challenges and eventually shape the built environment. So for me, I grew up in Montreal with my siblings and my mom. We lived a pretty wonderful but very simple childhood. My parents immigrated to Canada and really just had a suitcase each. And so when we grew up, we really just had each other. Most of my family was not in Montreal with us, and we sort of learned how to play and be creative with each other. So for example, when we wanted to have a good time, I have 4 other siblings. If we were bored, we would sort of take all the books in our house and play library, and we would put the back of the book, we would put a little envelope where there could be a card where you check out the books and get stamps and pretend checking out. Obviously, my older brother was the librarian, and we all needed to follow his rules. Reflecting back on it, it was really a form of us being creative and finding ways to create worlds with what we had. We also would make skits, and we would reenact stories and sort of put them on, make costumes and scenery. Or we would play a lot outside. We'd have soccer games together, play hockey on the street, or rake a big pile of leaves and spend the whole afternoon jumping. So for me, family was always really important and sort of is foundational to me even now. And then I am very influenced by my mom too. Growing up with her, she raised her 5 children, brought us through school, and also ran her own business. And she's very much creative. She creates hats. She started off with hair accessories and really started her own business and sort of made it from nothing. For me to also see her entrepreneurial spirit and her ability to sort of create opportunity from almost her imagination and her vision, but really also her hard work, was always served as a really important example for me. And even to now, anytime I have a business advice or something, I'll call my mom, and she's so resourceful in the way that she thinks through problems. That was really something that I lean back on almost all of the time. And then also we grew up very religious in a Jewish community, and so much of my education was what was foundational to it was this question of how are we serving the world? Really thinking about how can we make the world better and how could we help one another? Really, any subject that I learned in school or any extracurricular was really always grounded around this question that was bigger than oneself. And even to this day, I became less religious as I grew older and sort of evolved. But that part of it of thinking about why am I here and what am I doing, or what's the meaning, it's always an underlying question that I ask myself that has really guided a lot of my work and thinking about how we can be in service of others.
I like the way you describe your influence into architecture or just influence into life overall. Because in the beginning, you talk about these experiences that you had as a child, your imagination, and how powerful that could be. And then you start talking about your mom, how she used her imaginations to actually put things to work and to make things work. I can start to like think about the way that you start to connect this or will start to connect this to architecture later. So, what sparked your interest in architecture?
Yeah. Well, no one in my family or really in my community went to university. So, like, I didn't really have a model of how that's done or really like a roadmap of how to get there. Both my parents really valued education and they wanted us, but they weren't really able to give us advice on like the exact like particulars of what it is that you need to do. And I think I was fortunate because I'm like number 4, and so my older siblings, I was like standing on their shoulders in a sense where they figured out how to get there, how to apply, how to write letters. And it was really my sister, actually, when I graduated high school, I wasn't even thinking about applications, and she applied for me. And she was like, if you don't apply now, you'll have to wait a whole other year. And I mean, I'm so grateful to her for that. And I think she also understood like the importance of it. And it was nice because we're all really close in age together, my siblings, and we all went to university at the same time. So at McGill, the architecture school is part of the School of Engineering. And I went with my brother who was studying engineering. And so we sort of overlapped together. And I think I felt very supported. Even though we didn't exactly know what to expect, we were able to rely on each other. And we were all still living at home and studying at the same time. So there was like sort of this atmosphere of support very much. And so I think I didn't really know that I was interested in architecture until I was in architecture school, honestly. Like in Canada, you sort of have like 2 years of pre-university where you just need to find if you want to do social sciences or physical sciences. And I knew that I liked physics and math, so I picked physical sciences. I actually thought I wanted to do medicine. And then it's just 2 years, and I think within that time, somehow I decided architecture school, but I wasn't really certain of it. I think it was more knowing that I was creative and I liked art and making things. And I remember being very intimidated by the portfolio and not knowing what to put in there. So I took like a sketching class and put some of those sketches in there. And luckily, I got in. I didn't really apply anywhere else other than McGill. And then I remember the first day, one of the first lectures in architecture school, there was a professor, Ricardo Castro. And like McGill has this lecture hall that's like really dark and wood everywhere. The desks are sort of fixed and you're kind of just in the seat. The teacher's at a stage. It's also like with a big wooden desk and the room was all dark. And he was showing a slideshow and he was kind of saying that, if you want to study architecture, you need to love it. You need to have a passion for it. And he showed all of these images of him hugging columns. And I still remember that. That was sort of like an interesting introduction that like you sort of need the passion to drive you through. And then also he started showing Peter Zumthor. I remember he showed Bruderklaus, the chapel, and, architecture, like he was kind of describing it as an experience and how it could transport you and showing materiality and light. And I just loved that. That like really resonated with me in the way that he was talking about it as something that was like bigger than oneself. And then similarly, like whenever we had crits, that was like also mind-blowing experience. It really sort of reminded me of my Jewish education, which was really about like exchange and dialogue, where there was always like a little bit of an intellectual exchange about like what your perspective on something is and how could we go back and forth. And crits are sort of like that, where everyone needs to sort of defend their own position and you're sort of coming with your own perspective, but then there'll be like a response and you have to overlay that or negotiate that with the way other people are seeing the world. And you sort of start realizing that there isn't always one right answer, but there are many answers and you could kind of iterate based off of that so that it makes the most sense for you, but also for others. And so I kind of thrived in architecture school. I think in many ways I was lucky because I didn't really know that it would be right for me until I was there, honestly.
I find that so interesting because most people are like, oh, I wanted to do architect. I'm not making fun of anyone. I wanted to do architecture ever since I was little. I used to draw buildings. And for you, it was like, I was interested in science and architecture just came up. And I actually really love the way that you talked about it because not as many people talk about experience when it comes to architecture, not that many talk about like the transition to lights. And you talked about really good authors too that have influenced this more like artistic side of architecture that focuses more on the experience that the users go through when dealing with architecture. And honestly, I feel like I can relate to a little bit of that. Like, I enjoy a lot of the experience part of the architecture. So I really like the way that you described that. Many people think about the outside and how big something looks, how pretty something looks, where you're like, no, it's about what you're feeling when you're walking in the building.
Totally.
And going from there, once you started studying architecture, can you describe the architecture in Canada and what made you want to study in the US?
Yeah. At McGill, a big focus was history and theory, where there was an emphasis on what are the foundations of architecture a little bit. And the precedents that we learned at McGill was like Piranesi or Le Corbusier, Bernini, like a lot of bigger figures that I think in many ways sort of uplifted like this singular voice, like the architect is genius, you know, the Howard Roark model where someone is coming with a really big idea, solving everything. And what I appreciated about that, I mean, there are obviously a lot of challenges that, and I definitely don't see architecture like that now. But I think what I really appreciate about it was like this focus on a concept. Like we would always talk about a partie sketch. Like you couldn't have a project and not have a partie, which was basically like the big idea or the vision that's gonna make all of the other moves will sort of align to it. And I think only after I left McGill did I realize that that was almost unique to McGill. And so there was a little bit of a push for this sort of abstract idea. And then also a real emphasis on like the experience that we were just talking about, like phenomenology. I remember that word. I almost could never pronounce it, but it was like, how are all of our senses engaging with space? And what's touch, smell? Like, how do we really feel and experience that space? But to be honest, the entire time when I was at McGill, I didn't really think I was going to be an architect. You know, a lot of people say that it's a good designer's degree that you can do many things with. And I sort of saw myself more in that camp because I think I wasn't really aware of like contemporary landscape of architecture until I went to Harvard and I came to the US. And that really almost opened my mind to like more of like the international world of architects and the different ways that people now are actually solving design and addressing current needs. I think what was so special about the GSD are the people who ran studios. We would have Francis Curet or Toshiko Mori, and like they were really kind of getting at bigger problems and each of them bringing their own approach of how they could solve something. And that made me realize that there are many ways to practice architecture itself, that you can actually use architecture as a vehicle for social change and to make a difference inside the world. And it wasn't really something that was dead, but it was actually a lot more alive and animated and like connected a lot of worlds. So I really, really liked how it sort of broadened my perspective. That was also one of the main reasons why I wanted to come to the US was because I did my bachelor and my master's at McGill. And I knew that it was really just one perspective. And so this was really an opportunity to see design through another lens. But I think also you only kind of realize really who you are or like what's meaningful to you when you move away from it. I never really identified as Canadian until I came to the US. And then I'm like, well, actually, there are a few differences. I mean, the first time I went to the doctor, I couldn't believe that I didn't have to wait, for example. The social services that you get in Canada, you just take for granted. Like everybody has health insurance. Everybody gets 1 year maternity leave. You don't pay for university. Like all of McGill was such a minimal pay that I remember when I saw the tuition for the GSC, I just couldn't believe it. I was like, what do you mean? Like, so it was just a really big difference of like this sort of sense of that there's a social infrastructure that's sort of supporting people that I took for granted a lot when I was growing up. And I sort of was faced with it a lot more, especially when I entered the profession and like graduated from school. So I think that was a difference that I realized working. But of course, like I love it here and I continue to stay here because of all of the amazing people that are here and the opportunity and the potential to make a difference in this space and to maybe even like apply some of this mindset into the work that we're doing now and to sort of think about like how could architecture support other people and how could we sort of make a difference with the agency that we have and like the training and education that we have.
Before I respond, a year of maternity leave?
Isn't that crazy? And like at 90% pay. Like everybody takes it. Like it's nuts. Yeah. And I really think like having like a social safety net that everybody could rely on is like super important. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. So when you first came here, there was a lot of transitions, like with education-wise and just country-wise and the different lifestyles. How did you go from managing all those things to starting your career in the U.S. as well?
Yeah. When I first came to the US, I thought I was really just going to attend school and then go back to Canada. But I met my first employer, Peter Rose, when I was at the GSD. He came to one of the reviews, and I just really liked the way he was talking about design and sort of responding. He's also from Montreal, so we were able really to connect on that. And I worked for him one summer. And then when I graduated, I really wanted to continue working with him. And I think he's very much an educator too. He taught at the GSD for 20 years. He runs his studio almost like a studio at school, where there's really a lot of discussion and thinking and research. All of that informs the work. And I was very eager when I graduated to like understand, how do buildings come together? Like, how does something actually get built? You don't really learn that in architecture school. It really is something that gets applied in practice. And I really love the way that he sort of put so much attention and care into the design, that I thought that that would be like a perfect place to be able to learn that. Similarly, actually, I also wanted to get my Aries. I really just wanted to almost call myself an architect and really feel like I could start designing and building too. And right away, like, one of the things that I realized was the difference between practice of architecture and the education of architecture. I loved architecture school, right? I loved all that intellectual debate, all of the dialogue. Almost everything that you're doing in school is schematic design. And, like, you finish and you present your project and that's it. It's done. And then you start and you do another one. But then when you go into practice, you realize, first of all, like, the delay of when do you see actually the impact of the work? And then what's the value of that impact? Like, that's so different than what you see in school. First, because sometimes you don't control exactly which projects you're going to get. Sometimes you start them and then they don't continue, or something happens, the market changes, something happens with the client. So, like, so many other real life conditions. And you realize that that initial discussion that you have about an idea, there's so many other further following steps that need to be taken until that thing becomes realized. And me, I really started wondering, like, what contribution do I want to make to the field? And after having gone to school and 3 degrees and like doing so much work, like, what's the value of that? Or how am I actually going to be helping others through that? Why is it meaningful? And I actually got really fortunate to work on a project that totally changed my career, I would say. Our office was in the same building as a nonprofit called More Than Words. They were on the 2nd floor. We were on the 5th floor. It was like this industrial building. So we got to know this nonprofit because they were our neighbors and they wanted to expand. They were a bookstore, but primarily online. And what they would do is they hired young people who wouldn't be able to find a job. They were either in the foster care system, in the criminal system, they were facing homelessness, and they would take them and train them on how to run this business, but also train them on how to apply for college, how to interview for another job, and really set them up for success once they graduated More Than Words. So it was like a 2-year program. And it was really big for me because it was the first time I was leading the project. It was a sort of a smaller project from the office, and I really had the support of the principals and Peter to be able to have really good design discussions. So make sure that the work was kind of developing in a creative way, but then even on a broader scale, instead of talking about individual preferences, we were talking about, like, what's the mission of this organization? How do we serve the most young people? How do we bring light to the work that they're doing? How do we bring presence at the street level? Suddenly, everyone in the neighborhood knew that they were there because they started occupying the ground floor. And it was transparent and open, and it was really celebrating the work that they were doing and the transformation that was going on over there. And they started connecting. And for me, it was extremely rewarding because, I passed by every day and I saw what it was like for a project to start from an idea, to fundraise for the project, to bring on a contractor, make it real, and then the impact. You see how different it was, where before it was a boarded up storefront nobody could engage with, and then suddenly it was a space that could have events. They were able to host it. So it was so special that when it was done, I was just like, I need to do more of this. And I started thinking a lot, are there architecture firms that specialize in working with nonprofits and working on mission-driven work? I actually did a big survey at the time. There was maybe 5, there weren't many. And I was like, well, maybe it would be interesting to start thinking about like what could be a new model of practice that really serves mission-driven organizations and starts thinking about how you could have design where so many times it's really just for a really narrow group of people, but how could you have design really serve and impact people who really need it, it could really transform their lives? And so that sort of got me onto a journey that made me start architecture for public benefit.
Wow. Honestly, that's really cool. I liked how you described it in the beginning. You talked about the transition from student to just like seeing what you're interested in. And I know you also talked about earlier how you didn't even know if you were going to go into architecture. And so you started to like try to find your place in architecture and started to see what matters to you. And I know that definitely goes into why you design. So before we do talk about architecture for public benefit, can we talk about your design philosophy?
Yeah. For me, I start with the idea that we all know, but maybe we don't recognize that design is everywhere. It's all around us, and so much so that it often goes unnoticed. And the built environment has a profound power to affect how we feel, how we behave, the sort of relationships that we have. And once you recognize that, then you realize that as someone who is shaping the built environment, actually, we have sort of responsibility to think about how we can be thoughtful and inclusive and accessible in the way that we create spaces. And so for me, it's really important to be community-centered and to work with others. I actually tell a lot of our partners that architects are professionals when it comes to designing and realizing a building, but we're not professionals in whatever neighborhood we're working in or whatever community we're partnering with. And so that's why it's so important to really have that dialogue or have that exchange with our partners so that we're learning from each other and that we're learning from their expert lived experience, and that starts informing the way that we move design forward. And I very much believe that as much as possible, we should try to demystify architecture, demystify the process, bring other people in so that people could understand what architects do and where we could start communicating our value and sort of saying like, why is design important and how could it help you? How could it amplify the work that you're doing, the way you're helping and serving others? And then how could we teach people design literacy, like bring others on so that they now have the vocabulary and the agency to also make change within their own environment and their own communities, and they understand the mechanisms of how cities are shaped and designed so that they could be more active in the shaping of their community beyond even this one project.
I really like how you talk about the communication of architecture because that's very important. I feel like architecture is a little bit undervalued. That's something that worries me. And so I do think that when you're talking about how like people need to understand the value of design, what community could look like versus what they do. I grew up in Las Vegas, and in Las Vegas, every community looks the same. At least every gated community looks the same. And I feel like that's not how it's supposed to be. A house is your first introduction to architecture, but houses don't always seem unique to certain families. And I feel like if people understood what design is and how that can influence their lives, then they would value it a lot more.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of our responsibility in many ways because that's our life. We're sort of like dealing with design the entire time, and we need to start thinking about how we could explain that process to other people and explain what it is that we do or how we work with other people to form a result that will make a difference. I think a good example that everyone could understand is almost like the Apple Store, where the value of that design, of that space, is a way to like kind of reflect the identity of Apple as really trying to innovate and bring technology to improve people's lives. Think about the value that the design of that space is bringing to just a company. And I would say the same thing where we could change how a community develops, how an organization prospers, how other people will start to activate a space just by making key design decisions that open it up to the street, that make it inviting and visible to others, that let others really engage with the building. So I think there's a lot that we can do, and as much as possible to talk with non-architects so that we're able to explain a little bit why we're doing it and how we could help others.
And now that we're talking about design philosophy, I know that you were a Rose Fellow in Boston. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in Boston?
Yeah, sure. It was an incredible experience. It was funded by the Enterprise Community Partners, and they have a Rose Fellowship where they basically connect community architects with organizations across the country. Most of the time it's a CDC, but in this case, I was actually partnered with the city of Boston. And what I really liked about that job is right away it was a shift where the city of Boston is really all about serving the public and how could we make design accessible to everyone. I was working as part of the Department of Neighborhood Development and also the Mayor's Office of Housing. And we were really thinking about how could we develop design initiatives that will make this city more affordable, more accessible, and make it easier for people to live in the city. We all know that there's like a housing crisis in so many cities across the US. And so one of the initiatives that I was working on was developing ADUs, additional dwelling units. And the city really had it set in place, but it wasn't easy for people to apply to it. And it was really just for ADUs that are inside the building. And we were targeting existing buildings, so old carriage houses or garages that are on the site, and thinking about how they could be permitted into living spaces, because right now no one is legally allowed to live in them. And how could they become safe spaces that then almost become naturally occurring, affordable housing? And it was really interesting because rather than working on just an individual project, it was a lot broader where we were thinking citywide and thinking on how we could enact impactful policy and zoning changes that would affect many people. I also did a lot of design review, which was basically the city funds a lot of projects that are either on city-owned land or they're helping housing developments. And they're the small staff of architects that review any of those projects at all of the design phases. And we just ensure that it's sort of meeting the design standards and that it's really working within the context and the neighborhood, that the community is happy with it. And that was also a shift in scale where rather than looking at individual projects, we were working with different design and development teams, working with the developers and meeting with them, never designing a whole project, but always trying to strategically shift it so that it would go in a direction that really best serves Boston residents and homeowners. So that was really incredible. And it also made me realize I had an amazing boss, Jay Lee, and he always would tell me, Hana, you need to show off a little. Like if we're at a meeting, you need to tell people what you know. And I think I was maybe hesitant to do that, but it sort of made me realize that because it was so many different agencies coming together, a lot of different departments, many times I was finding myself in a room where I was the design professional and I was the one who was supposed to explain that perspective to everyone. And there was no one else that was supposed to do that. And so he really would encourage me and almost guide me to be able to speak up and explain, like, oh, why is design in this instance important, or why thinking about it in this different way will make a difference. And so it was a really incredible training. And in many ways, even what I'm trying to do with architecture for public benefit is apply that strategy of really thinking about how we could best serve the public. Cities do so well, but it's in the public sector. How could we do that in private practice?
From the way that you described, architecture worked very differently over there. And I feel like that also, you found your place. You were able to connect it back to what you valued in architecture. And I feel like that was very important because they're literally building an entire city based on how people experiences are. And you got to be around people who tried to understand architecture, even if they weren't architects, who pretty much all united under like a same mind. And you worked with developers and you got all this experience to be able to push for public benefit. And going into that, can you talk about what motivated you to start architecture for public benefit and the beliefs behind the practice?
Yeah. Well, I really believe that good design can and should be for everyone. I spent 7 years working with Peter, and I really loved that like everything was just so meticulously looked at because we believed that like it made a difference in how you would feel inside that space. And so how could everybody get that? How could we think about putting that same attention and love and energy for communities that don't often think to even hire an architect or understand how it works. So that's really what I'm trying to do, almost develop a new model of practice that makes it really possible and self-generating so that the work actually could bring on more work and that we could help support others in this way. I think that was like a big drive for why I wanted to do that. And I also really wanted to make it clear that that's the mission of the practice. That's why I named it Architecture for Public Benefit, so that all of the work is really in line in service of finding ways to help others. And that really goes back to this question of how do I find meaning in what I'm doing? How do I get excited every morning to wake up and do what I want to do? And a big difference in the way that we practice design is we actually think a lot about like pre-design services. So how could we help our partners or people that we want to work with to think about how they could make a project real even before they know how to make it real? So this question of how could we talk to other people and let them know the value about design, this is a big thing, because a lot of times when we'll talk to a nonprofit, we could explain to them that like architects are storytellers. We know how to tell stories. We know how to create a vision. That's what we all do in school and that we love to do. And that's a really valuable skill that could help nonprofits build consensus and get others on board. So if they have a desire to grow and amplify their mission, we could actually tell that story of what that could look like. And nothing's more powerful than, for example, a visual that they could use to fundraise with or to apply for grants with. And we really specialize in doing that so that we can help nonprofits get the funding that they need to realize the project and serve their communities. So we'll also often help with grants or we'll make them available. And we realize that with more experience, because we've developed many of these projects, most community organizations, when they're thinking about a renovation or thinking about improving their space, oftentimes it's the first time that they're doing it. And so the skills of an architect coming in and having some of that perspective and being able to guide leaders of that space to be able to really do an impactful renovation project and also make it happen. So that entrepreneurial spirit, we really don't necessarily wait for people to come to us. We really will try to find opportunities, think about where is there a space that our perspective and our services could help someone, and then we'll approach them and we'll be like, well, what about if you thought about doing this way? Do you think that the space could be optimized, could really help others? And so really maybe shifting a little bit how we think about the work.
I really like your responses. And I also like the fact that you did name it Architecture for Public Benefit. You're like, I'm already going to narrow down what this is before anyone comes to me with any project.
Yeah.
And how like you really, really, again, like you're sticking to your mission. You're sticking to the things that you value. And you're really good with that. You're very driven. And I feel like that does help a lot because people see that. And you reach out and you start increasing the value of what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And you start explaining to people and showing them what architecture is, what it can mean for their lives and how it can change their lives. And with that, you're able to make a difference because you're allowed to help people who have never experienced architecture before experience it.
Yeah, we're actually working on a project that's exactly that. It's called Design with a Mission. It's going to be published like virtually so that everybody could access it. I mean, that's another big part of what we're trying to do is really make information available to help people. So this is work that everybody needs to be doing. And so how could we work collaboratively to share the knowledge that we gain so that we're building on each other's successes? And so with Design with a Mission, it's a resource for community organizations to be able to understand what are the questions, how design could improve their operations, can improve the services that they're offering. And so we'll interview and talk with other nonprofit leaders or community developers, ask them questions, and almost create a resource that makes hard to find information like readily available. So even if someone before they're ready to hire an architect or really thinking about it, they can find information that's going to answer a lot of the questions that otherwise it's not that easy to Google and find because architecture is so specialized. And most architects don't really publish behind the scenes work or knowledge. And so how could we share that? I think a lot about science actually and how there's like peer reviewed journals and how in many ways scientists are always building on each other's work because you're publishing it and then people could see, oh, that protocol, I could use that protocol to then develop something else. And I think architects can sort of use a similar model where everything from like building, but also what are the processes and things that you're implementing in practice that other firms could use so that there could be 10 different versions of this model and the impact could be that much broader.
You're not just challenging developers, you're not just challenging the way that other people see architecture, you're also challenging architecture itself and how that impacts all the other firms and everybody else who's working on architecture. That's very valuable.
The same way we think creatively about projects, I think there's really room to think creatively about how we run firms, how we get projects, how we fund projects. So many resources go into developing work, and I really wanted to shift away from developing like a single family house that helps just one family maybe on the summers, but how could we make design help many people and really feel like there is that much more value that comes with the work.
Yeah. And throughout all the work that you've been doing with architecture and communities and making architecture become something for public benefit, you have also been a teacher and an educator. Can you talk about what inspired you to be a professor and what those experiences are like?
Yeah, I love teaching, and I think a really important part of teaching is thinking about the impact that it's going to have and how students will become future leaders. And so how could we teach students to then change the profession once they enter it and could sort of make meaningful change and take all of their background and all of their history and all of their identity to either impact their own communities or wherever they end up. I'm very inspired by students now who are so much more than I ever was, honestly, but so socially aware and really driven to address all the challenges that we're facing now, whether it's climate change or inequity, and really want to make a positive difference. And so much of my teaching, I mean, I'm very much also a lifelong learner. I want to continue learning out. I can't get away from school. But then I get to work with students who continue to inspire me, but then I could also help provide the perspective of someone in practice and how that could inform a lot of the academic work. I never, for example, had any community engagement classes, or I never really was trained when I was in school thinking about how we could work in a different way. And I think as much as possible, if we could start really broadening our perspective of what design, even education could be, I think that would also make a big difference. And the other thing that's really interesting about academia is there's a lot of research that's naturally done in school that I think isn't done as much in practice. So I oftentimes think of myself as bridging those two, and how could we help students understand the way the real world works so that they are better prepared when they graduate. But then also, how could we help people in practice really apply all of that optimism and energy that you see in school? I think an example of that is I'm really fascinated by post-occupancy evaluations. They're like the only established form that architecture has to measure our impact. And if we care about the difference that we're making, why aren't we establishing metrics or even evaluating a little bit what we have done? We have a lot of design ambitions and there's a design intent, but could we close the feedback loop between that design intent and the actual results? So that's super interesting to me, and that's very much like a research-driven side that I think academia and the institution could help, and that would need to be bridged with practice. So like once a building is out in the world, how is it performing? How are people reacting to it? What are the changes that are being made? And so I'm teaching a class at the University of Chicago. It's called The Life of Buildings, and it's very much about that question. Is like we look at 4 different buildings in the city, and it's also an opportunity for students to go out in the city and to critically examine the built environment, to think about like, oh, these are spaces that I'm living in, that I'm occupying it. How are they actually working? And so making more evident this reality that design does make a difference. And to also be critical, like what's working, what's not working, and how could we measure that so that we're better informed when we're doing the next project.
Yeah. I do like what you said, how like bringing this optimism into architecture. Like if there's anything that I've learned maybe working at a firm is how different it is in the way that like sometimes it does question a little bit whether I want to do architecture because I enjoy the experience of architecture and I enjoy what the experiences you get from the built environment. And I'm worried that when it comes to working in a firm, sometimes that disappears. Sometimes that gets diminished into just being someone who works on Revit or works on the things that they're pushed into. But again, all the optimism and the design and everything that you're learning in architecture, it gets pushed away sometimes.
Yeah.
And that's something that we don't talk about enough in school. Like, how do we make sure that the design intent continues? And how do we prepare students who are the future in architecture to continue to value that no matter where they end up working and no matter what type of practices or what type of career they end up having? If you have a response.
I think that's a super important question. And I'm a very optimistic person in general. And I think that there's a lot that we could do when we work together. And especially when we know what we're doing. What's the vision of the work? And I think I would encourage students to really realize that you don't have to fall into a situation, but you could actually create one. There is an abundance of work. There are an abundance of problems that could be addressed through design. And design is generous. And if you find the right places to enact it, then you will be driven by that passion to do the work. And this abundance is in any place that you're working or in any scenario. And so sometimes I think it's a little shift of a mindset where you think about, like, what could I do? Like, even if you're working in a firm that doesn't specialize in it, there's always opportunity even there. Can you find a project that would be helpful? Can you suggest? I think this podcast is a good example, honestly, because there wasn't a podcast before and you guys sort of created it out of nothing because you saw that there was a need to tell people stories, to understand what is beneath everyone's public persona. And so that same spirit of really finding a problem to solve and then just doing it, I think could very well apply in architecture. And of course, you can't escape that once you really want to build something, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But if you really believe in the project, that gives you that energy to keep going because there's that North Star that's like, oh, the result of this is really going to make a difference. I really believe in, like, I don't mind doing a door schedule because all of these doors are part of this project that's really important, that when it's out in the real world, I'm going to be proud to have contributed to it.
And also, like, going back to your teaching, right? I think what also helps with being able to explain these things to students is your background in Canada and also how you were taught in the GSD, because you're able to look at architecture from like an optimistic way, theoretical way, and also as a practical way. And it also does trace back to your childhood as well, how like in the beginning, the first thing you mentioned was your imagination and having fun as a kid with your imagination, connecting that to work and connecting that to what can be done and being the first to do things, being the first to make change and to change people's perspective on things. I think that's really important for people to know and see and learn and value. What advice would you give to someone who wants to make a positive impact with design?
I think it's important to be curious and kind when you design and to think about how you can help. So instead of thinking about what you'll get out of it, think about what others will get out of it. And sometimes when you give like that, it's almost like the best gift that you can get because there's so much meaning that comes from it. And so I really like the Mr. Rogers quote, find the helpers, because whenever everything is negative or whatever, to really introduce optimism and not just find the helpers. So that's like making sure that you're collaborating with others who see the same way, who really believe in a vision for a positive change, but also to be the helper. Is there a problem that you could solve that you uniquely, with your own perspective, with your own knowledge, could solve? And then go for it. See how you could build a team and a plan and enact it.
And that's very good advice. I feel like I understand that, especially, again, with the podcast and being able to go out there and just experience different things. I feel like a lot of students need to hear that. So before we end our episode, I have one last question. What do your future plans and goals look like?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to what we were talking about before. which is really broadening the way that architects think about the work and developing a model of practice where many people are doing this kind of work and feel like it's a real way that you can make it happen. It's not like a fringe thing, but there's a sort of like a path to be able to still pay your bills and still be happy in the work, but also help others. I think that's like the biggest goal is, the Whitney Young speech from the AIA convention in 68, where he sort of says that like architects have sort of distinguished themselves as irrelevant, the most irrelevant profession, is sort of changing that. That's still so true even now. And so when we're talking about communicating the value of design for others, that's part of it, is like really entering beyond our profession and partnering with others so that we're not irrelevant and we actually could really develop a model where we make a sometimes I worry that I'm saying the same thing over and over, but I really think about it a lot. But yeah, just so that other architects feel like that they could do this work, that we could be like citizens in this world and take all of our identities and everything that we have so that we're making the city a better place.
I'm excited to see what architecture does become. There might be a big turnaround on what architecture ends up meaning to a lot of people. And I'm very excited for that because it does need to change. People need to value this profession a lot more. And even some of the architecture process, it could be better because going to school for architecture, we do so much with design. We do so much with trying to bring out the creativity of students, especially when they've already had like 12 years of school. And that can't be lost once people enter the field, which is why I really enjoyed this conversation with you. I feel like not as many people see architecture that way. And it's really nice to meet somebody who is actively trying to change that and will continue to change that. So thank you for being here with us today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Caleb. It's really inspiring to see what you guys are doing and what you're building and to just be a small part of that. I'm honored. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone who's listening. We release our episodes monthly. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow us on Instagram at beyondthesurface_NOMAS IIT. I want to thank our producer, Kayla Kwok, and the NOMAS IIT team for making this podcast possible. Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond the Surface featuring Chana Haouzi. Until next time, goodbye.